How we give, receive, and respond to information is the core of all communication. How we choose what we say and understand what someone else says is so important. With this being said, let's take a look at the process of communication and how problems occur depending on our word choice. So to start, we need to take a look at some models of communication. And models of communication teach us the different elements that exist in the communication process. Models show us specific parts of the communication process and help us understand where miscommunication happens. This allows us to fix a situation and learn how to prevent further miscommunication. There are 3 models that are used to explain the communication process. Each of these models builds on the others. The 3 models of communication are 1. Transmission, 2. Interaction, and 3. Transaction. So, to start, let's take a look at the first one, which is the transmission model of communication. And the transmission model of communication, sometimes referred to as the action model or linear model, consists of 5 parts: sender, message, channel, receiver, and noise. Now let's take a look at sender. Sender. The sender is the person who is the source of the message, the person who crafts and creates and drafts the message that's being sent. The sender's job is to encode meaning into a format that can be transmitted to another person. The sender might encode the message into spoken words, written words, or even into visual signals, such as facial expressions, etc., in order to share the message with another person. So again, sender, we've all been a sender of a message. It is our job to create and draft the message that we're trying to send. Now let's take a look at the message itself. The message is what you're trying to say or get across. The message is the content or the meaning that is being conveyed. A message can be your thoughts, ideas, information, and how you're feeling. Next, let's take a look at channel. The channel is the means through which the message is being conveyed or how you're sending the message. The communication channel might be a telephone call, text message, email, FaceTime, YouTube, a lot of different ways. In these channels, you might include sounds, text, or facial expressions. For example, if you call someone and say, "I love you," the sound of the words and the telephone signal are the channel, and the meaning communicated with those words is the message. Now let's take a look at receiver. Receiver. The receiver is the person to whom the message is sent. When the message is sent through the channel, the receiver must decode the signal and convert it into meaning. For example, when the sender says, "I love you" on a telephone call, the telephone signal is converted back into sound waves, and the sound of the words is decoded into the meaning by the receiver's brain. The decoding process will likely involve a consideration of relationship with the sender or cultural understanding of the message and the context. Again, the receiver, their job is to try to figure out what the message from the sender is trying to say. Now, let's take a look at noise. Noise is anything that interferes with the receiver's ability to decode and understand the message. There's many types of noise. Environmental or physical noise includes sounds that interfere with the ability to hear messages, such as people talking in the room, police sirens outside, or even the sound of an air conditioning turning on. Psychological noise exists when thoughts, attitudes, and emotions, and things that are just in our head interfere with our ability to listen and understand a message. Again, it's in our head. For example, if the person you're talking to is preoccupied with other thoughts, has a negative attitude towards what you're saying, is sad or angry about a personal reason, or has an emotional reaction to the topic, those mental states can make it difficult for that person to focus on what you're trying to tell them. A lack of accessibility and inclusivity in a presentation or conversation or in your message can lead to frustration, anger, and dismissal, which can contribute to psychological noise and disengagement from the person that you're trying to talk to. To minimize these noises, make sure to be considerate of who you're talking to. Each individual is different, and as presenters and communicators, we should always work to minimize all types of noise so that all members have the opportunity to be engaged and remain engaged throughout the presentation. Again, an effective communicator understands their audience and tries to craft the ideal message in order for the receiver to be able to process that information. The transmission model of communication assumes that communication is happening in only one direction. One person is sending a message and the other person is receiving it. This model represents what happens in many media contexts, such as TV, radio, newspaper, podcasts, what you're listening to now and watching now, and email, to name a few, in which a source is sending messages to another person or to an audience. But communication is not being sent both ways. This model is limited and does not fully represent many other communication situations, which is why our second model, the interaction model, was developed. The interaction model of communication. The interaction model of communication, also sometimes called the convergence model, includes all of the components of the previous model, but it adds two new components: feedback and context. Now, feedback. Feedback is the message that is sent as a response to the sender's message. Feedback can be verbal or nonverbal. It's your facial expressions. It can be saying ooh, ah. It's any feedback that you're giving back. It might happen immediately or it can be delayed. For example, during a face-to-face conversation or phone call, you will probably respond immediately to what that person is saying. Whereas, when you're emailing someone or text messaging, you have to wait, right? There is some waiting period before you receive feedback. Next is context. Context is the physical, psychological, and cultural environment in which a communication event takes place. The physical context includes the environmental factors, such as the size of the room, the background noise, whether or not you're speaking indoors or outdoors, the temperature, and a bunch of other things that are related to the location in which you are speaking. The psychological context includes the mental and emotional influences on our communication. For example, whether we are angry at or friendly with another person will determine and impact how we interpret our messages. This interpretation based on our feelings about the individual may cause us to overlook important features of the message or to evaluate each statement in the worst or best possible way. If someone is angry or sad about a recent tragedy, comments that might seem neutral can come across as insensitive or upsetting. The cultural context includes the cultural expectations and social norms associated with the situation in which you are speaking. For example, some cultures expect individuals to get directly to the point, be a little bit more blunt than others, while other cultures expect a more nuanced, roundabout way of sharing messages. Some situations have expectations for what should be said and how it should be said. We call these communication scripts. Think about the kind of expectations you might have for how to end a conversation, how to give a wedding toast, how to say goodbye, and those expectations for what is ideal can vary widely by cultural and familial norms. It all depends. It depends on the context itself. By adding feedback, the interaction model of communication accounts for the way that we send messages back and forth in conversations with others. In this model, people in the communication interaction alternate going back and forth between being the sender and the receiver. The interaction model also takes into account the physical, psychological, and cultural context in which communication is taking place, and accounts for the ways that the context both creates expectations for and changes the effect of the message. So there are a lot of variables in play when it comes to communication. And the best way to, again, be the best communicator that you can be is to understand your audience, understand who you're speaking to, and adopt your message appropriately. Over the course of a conversation, the sender becomes the receiver and vice versa, over and over and over again. This model represents the type of communication where two people take turns sending and receiving the messages, such as text message conversations, emails, and even phone calls. There are all examples of communication that are represented well by this particular model. This model of communication still doesn't fully account for the complexity of many face-to-face interactions, which is why the transaction model of communication was developed. Now let's take a look at the transaction model of communication. The transaction model of communication includes all of the elements that were previously stated from the previous models, but the biggest difference is that both parties in the conversation are simultaneously the sender and the receiver, and both are sending and receiving messages constantly throughout the interaction. In this model, both people are sending verbal or nonverbal messages continuously and are adjusting their communication in response to the messages they are receiving from one another. For example, if you start to give directions to someone and they give you a blank stare, like, I don't know what's going on, you might change the way that you are giving the directions by breaking them into smaller steps, drawing a map, or finding a easier way for them to understand your goal, which is giving directions. In this situation, the nonverbal message or the blank stare from the other person communicates to you that they are not understanding your message, and you will be motivated to change your message strategy immediately in the middle of the conversation, so you adjust in real time. We are constantly communicating and interpreting messages, and we even assign meaning to an absence of communication, silence or ghosting, when no one's really making a sound. Making that absence of a clear message a type of communication in and of itself. For example, if you say I love you to someone and you are met with silence, that silence is usually interpreted as speaking volumes, whether or not that is what the other person intends. So again, communication is about understanding feedback. And with that being said, again, a great communicator understands the situation, understands whom they're talking to, and tries to find the ideal approach to help the receiver understand the message that is being sent.